there's magic in your backyard. Go and find it.
We'll head around to all the towns, head away on holiday. South Aussie with Cosi's on sit down. South Aussie with Cosi.
G'day, my name's Cosi and this is Anzac Cove on the Gallipoli Peninsula here in Turkey. You know, as a boy I always dreamed of coming here and commemorating what the Anzacs did all those years ago. I grew up listening to the stories of the bravery and the courage of the Anzacs, and I'm truly blessed to be able to not only come here to show myself, but also to show you all just what happened here on Anzac Day all those years ago. I'll start by saying that at 4:30 a.m. on Anzac Day, the Anzacs rolled in here in boats, rowing them in. They got about 25 metres offshore and the Turks opened fire from up in the hills. Some of the Anzacs were shot in the boats before they even stood here in Turkey. So stay with me for the next half hour. We'll have a look around Gallipoli and we'll share some of their stories. The Anzacs landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, met by fierce resistance. Instead of finding the flat beach that they had expected, they found they'd landed at the wrong spot. They faced steep cliffs and huge enemy fire and shelling as well. Around 20,000 soldiers landed on the beach over the next 2 days. They faced a large Turkish force that were determined to defend their own country.
Lest you be forgotten, our brave Australians.
Fighting in Gallipoli soon settled into a stalemate. The Anzacs and the Turks dug in, quite literally, digging kilometres of trenches and pinned down each other's forces with sniper fire and shelling. It was the enormous job of digging the trenches that would earn the Anzacs the nickname of diggers. Thousands of Australian and New Zealand men died in the hours and the days that followed the landing at that beach. And all of this happened right here in Turkey, thousands of kilometres from Australia. Something that's really unique about the country Turkey is, and I didn't even know this till I got here, it is actually a part of two continents. Now the land behind me is Turkey, that's in Asia, and then we cross this stretch of water, which isn't that big, we hit the Gallipoli Peninsula, which is of course Europe. In fact, only 3% of Turkey is actually in Europe. The rest falls within Asia. War historian David Horner tells us exactly why the Anzacs were sent to Gallipoli in Turkey to fight.
What the British wanted to do was push through the Dardanelles with their warships and get to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, bombard the capital and persuade the Ottomans to surrender and open a sea route through the Dardanelles to Russia. When they tried to do this with the ships struck mines and could not get through. The decision was then made that what needed to happen was troops needed to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula to deal with the enemy guns and thereby enable the warships to get in, to clear the mines and to get through. As part of this landing by the British, the Anzac Corps had a role of landing further along the peninsula and pushing through the peninsula to gain a position of advantage to enable the British, who are landing further along the peninsula at Helles, to advance inland. And so the Anzacs had this important role in the landing at Gallipoli Peninsula.
South Aussie with Cosi. South Aussie with Cosi.
When it comes to cruise holidays, or in fact any holiday at all, Travel Superstore can get you there. They're South Australia's fastest growing travel agency with no online booking fees. Check out travelsuperstore.com.au. In fact, head to Travel Superstore's website right now because we're giving away a $1,000 travel voucher so you can have that well-deserved holiday that you've been waiting for. I've decided to dedicate an episode of South Aussie with Cosi to the Anzacs and actually head over to Gallipoli to retrace their steps. I travelled aboard a cruise ship that left Australia and was filled with over 2,000 Australians bound for Gallipoli to commemorate Anzac Day. Our cruise followed the steps the Anzacs took from Australia all the way to Gallipoli.
The first convoy, the large convoy, some 33,000 soldiers left from Albany in Western Australia. The convoy went across the Indian Ocean, up through the Suez Canal, and then they went to Egypt, where they trained for some months before the decision was made that they'd be used for the landing at Gallipoli. And then, of course, they had to go from Egypt. Some of them went across to the island of Lemnos, where they were prepared, then eventually for the landing here at Gallipoli.
This is Beach Cemetery, located at Hell's Point on the Anzac Cove, right on the southern headland. And this place contains the bodies of 380 soldiers who died here in Gallipoli. And in fact, this cemetery became a cemetery on day one of the Gallipoli campaign. Perhaps the best known soldier that lays under Turkish soil here in Gallipoli is that of Private John Simpson, who was a part of the Australian Army Medical Corps. Growing up as a child, I heard so many stories about the Anzacs and their bravery. My favourite, like many Australians, was Simpson and his donkey. And this is the gravesite of Mr. Simpson, who died at the age of 22. He was most famous for bringing wounded soldiers down here to the beach with the aid of his donkey. He did that for 3 weeks before he was killed. The journey to Gallipoli was super special for Pam. Pam's from Port Fairy and she's actually a distant relative of Simpson.
My grandmother's first cousin was Simpson, and yeah, we've grown up listening to his story all our lives, and it was just, yeah, so special to come here and, yeah, pay homage to him. He was born in England and came out to Australia, and he thought that a good way to get back to England was to join the Australian Army, thinking they were going to England, but of course they went to Egypt instead, and then he was landed on Anzac Cove. He was really good with animals, and he found a few donkeys, and he started using that to transport the injured soldiers back to camp.
We're here on North Terrace, and this has got to be one of my favourite monuments in South Australia because it kind of encapsulates the Anzac spirit.
And say your names with pride, your courage and your mateship in all of us lives on. I am the Anzac spirit.
Before we leave here on North Terrace, there's something inside that I want to show you.
We are one, but we are many.
This is a list of names of people from Adelaide that lost their life in Gallipoli, and it's when you read through these names and you see surnames of people that you know or relatives that it really strikes home how much this would have affected South Australia.
I am, you are, we are Australian.
South Aussie with Cosi. South Aussie with Cosi.
Welcome back, folks. We're having a look around the Gallipoli Peninsula here in Turkey, and this is one of the most famous, iconic spots on it, which is, of course, Lone Pine. You know, thousands of Australian and New Zealand, or Anzacs as they were called, lost their lives in this area. It's a special place for not only Australians and New Zealanders, but people from all over the world that come here to the Gallipoli Peninsula to celebrate Anzac Day. So I thought I'd ask a few of them, why do they make this pilgrimage?
When Damo talked about this 4 years ago, and to what the fellas went through 100 years ago, it's just, you just can't really describe it. To be here is just magnificent.
Incredibly proud, absolutely incredibly proud, and I just felt a lot of anger at the waste, the futility of it all, and yet just at the same time just so proud to be an Australian. It's just awesome, and if anybody wants to come to Gallipoli, if any Australian wants to make a pilgrimage, that's the place they should go. Absolutely.
Lone Pine is a very special part of the Anzac story. At 5:30 p.m. on the 6th of August 1915, the Australians charged from concealed trenches across no man's land towards the Turkish trenches. The troops paused on reaching the Turkish trenches, finding that many were covered by timber roofs. Some fired, bombed and bayoneted from above, and some actually found their way inside the trenches, and that's where the intense fighting began. Having captured the Turkish trenches, the Australians now tried so hard here at Lone Pine to hold on to what they had taken, while on the other hand, the Turks desperately and determinedly tried to throw the Australians out.
This place where we are standing now is called the Lone Pine, the most famous Australian cemeteries here, and it's named for the solitary Turkish pine which was here, which stood here during the very early stage of the fighting here.
Our Turkish war guide explains how a lot of the fighting was man on man.
It was a kind of the fist to fist and the hand to hand, the bayonets to bayonets war in the trenches. At the end, the casualties from the Turkish side reached the 7,000. Meanwhile, from the Australian sides reached to the number of the 2,000. In this area where we are standing is just the no man's land, and the Turkish forces was there and the Australian forces was there.
Here's something that you may not know. North Terrace in Adelaide has a very special connection with the lone pine tree here, all the way in Gallipoli in Turkey. This pine tree was a seedling that came from a seed from the lone pine tree at Gallipoli. Can you believe that? And it sits here on North Terrace. What I love even more is that just behind the pine tree is a gorgeous Australian gum tree.
I'm mindful of the dead and the dying. My best mate Mike lies beside me here crying. And I know now for sure that the English were lying when they sent us out here to die.
Vietnam veteran and Aussie rocker Normie Rowe is a good mate, and he also joined us on the trip. He talks about the Anzac spirit.
I was sitting in a little fire support outpost in Vietnam, and we'd just received 2 reinforcements, both from New Zealand. And I realised I was now in an Anzac troop. And I thought, you know, I really have to know as much as I can about what my tradition is and what I've needed to uphold. Now, don't blame the Turks, they're just fighting their war. The bastard Churchill's got a lot to answer for. And I wish it was him, and this blood and this gore instead of me, who's sent here to die. This is my 4th trip now, and the more I come here, the more I understand when I'm here in Gallipoli, and the memories that I have after that drives me to feel that I've been part of something incredibly special. So God save the King, God save the Queen, and God help anyone that's caught in between. I was born Australian and proud to have been, even though I'd been sent here to die. You know, it's really interesting. The Turks love the Anzacs. They love the Anzacs. But the Vietnamese who fought against us love the Uk Dai Loi, which is the Vietnamese term for big red rat, but it's actually a kangaroo, and Australians.
Something that I've really noticed about spending time here in Turkey is the sympathy that I have for the Turks that fought in the Gallipoli campaign. And you know, 100 years after that war, they still welcome Australians and New Zealanders with open arms and smiles. They're some of the friendliest people that I've ever met. And when you think about it, on Anzac Day, they faced an invasion into their country and they lost over 80,000 men. The words you see behind me are written by the Turks, and I love them. It says, "To the lost soldiers that are Australian and New Zealanders laying in this soil, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country, therefore rest in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have now become our sons as well."
South Aussie with Cosi. South Aussie with Cosi.
G'day, my name's Cosi and this is Anzac Cove on the Gallipoli Peninsula here in Turkey. The Anzacs rolled in here in boats, rowing them in. They got about 25 metres offshore and the Turks opened fire from up in the hills. Some of the Anzacs were shot in the boats before they even stood here in Turkey. When war broke out in 1914, Australia had been a federated nation for only 13 years, and its government were eager to establish a reputation amongst the nations of the world. The Australian and New Zealand forces landed on Gallipoli on the 25th of April, meeting fierce resistance from the Turkish defenders. What had been planned as a bold stroke to knock out Turkey from the war extremely quickly soon became a stalemate, and the campaign dragged on for 8 long months. Gallipoli had a profound impact on Australians back at home, and the 25th of April soon became the day on which Australians remembered the sacrifice of those who died in the war. Although the Gallipoli campaign failed in its military objectives, the actions of the Anzacs and the way they handled themselves during the campaign left a powerful legacy. What became known as the Anzac legend became an important part of the identity of both nations, shaping the ways in which they were viewed both in their past and also in their future. When you're walking in the same steps that the Anzacs took all those years ago, you have so many, what I guess I call wow moments, where you just stand there in sheer disbelief at what the Australian and the New Zealanders went through, and as well as the Turkish. Here's a classic example. The trench warfare was ruthless. Here you can see the trenches of the Australians, yet only metres away you've got the trenches that were occupied by the Turkish. So imagine being that close to your enemy, where any move could be your last.
It was really a miserable life in the trenches, certainly as the time went on from April into May and into June, and the hot months of June and July. Bodies are lying out there in no man's land, rotting, flies, lack of water, the heat, the constant shelling from the Turks. Every now and again for a while the Turks would attack until the Turks decided that they too had to stop all these fruitless attacks. But it was a miserable life there, and the food was poor, hygiene was desperately poor, and so bodies not buried, or if they're buried, sort of coming to the surface again. It really was a most difficult time.
Over 50,000 Australians served here on the Gallipoli Peninsula. To put that into some kind of perspective, picture Adelaide Oval in South Australia, bumper to bumper full of people. That's the kind of number we're talking about. Now, half of those became casualties and over 8,000 died. But the real amazing statistic is those numbers are so huge, but way back then in 1915, the population of Australia was under 5 million people. Nowadays, our population's over 24 million, which would be the same as 250,000 people going over to fight right now, and almost 40,000 Australians dying. Can you imagine Australia today losing 40,000 people in a war? From this vantage point, you really get a feel for just how tough the Anzacs had it. The Turks, well, they were located in these trenches right up on the top of this ridge, yet the Anzacs, who landed at Anzac Cove, had to get up this terrain, which is practically impossible. The toughness of the fighting and the trench warfare was one thing, but possibly the cleverest move by the Anzacs was the evacuation when they actually left Gallipoli.
The evacuation was very carefully planned, and I like to think that the man who planned it, who was the Chief of Staff of the Anzac Corps, an Australian, Brigadier General Brudenell White, he thought, I've got to train the troops. No, I don't have to train the Australians or the New Zealanders. I've got to train the Turks. And what I'll do is we'll go quiet for a while. When they go quiet, the Turks would jump out of their trenches and start to come towards the Australian lines, and then they get shot. So you're training the Turks that when everything goes quiet, you don't get out of the trenches and come across and have a look and see what's going on. The idea being, of course, when eventually they did go quiet and they left, the Turks remained in their trenches and they didn't attack. And that was known as the silent stunt. Now, there are other things that were done, very careful planning. Troops would come in during the day where they could be seen to be coming in, and then they'd go out at night and try and disguise the fact that an evacuation was coming up. I think about 2 Australians were shot during the evacuation, when it was thought at one stage 1/3 of the force might become casualties during the evacuation. So it was a quite brilliantly conducted evacuation with far fewer casualties than has been expected.
We talk about the losses of men in their thousands here at Gallipoli, but when you're actually here walking where the Anzacs actually walked, you break it down from the masses to the individuals. Each soldier that lost their life here had a story. They had a mother, siblings, wives, many had children. And they were also all so young. In fact, the youngest was said to be Private Jim Martin at 14 years and 9 months of age, who, like so many others, lied about his age in order to fight for his country. Whilst it's now over 100 years since the Anzacs landed here on Gallipoli, their sacrifices will never be forgotten, for it was those Anzacs that actually shaped Australia into the great country that it still is today. Lest we forget. Well, that's all we've got time for, and we're going to finish the show here at Anzac Cove. This is the spot where the Anzacs rolled into on Anzac Day all those years ago. I hope that this episode has inspired you to travel to Gallipoli to commemorate Anzac Day, and I hope it helps keep that Anzac Day spirit alive and well, and if not, make it burn even brighter, because I believe personally that the Anzac spirit is what shapes Australia and makes it the country it is today. We'll catch you around. This show is brought to you by Travel Superstore. Based here in South Australia, Travel Superstore specialise in war tours all over the world. Head to travelsuperstore.com.au to find out more about the tours, and head there right now because they're also giving away a $1,000 travel voucher. Good luck!
South Aussie with Cosi.
I like possums.